Okay, now first thing first, download the Excel shell file that contains this information. Okay, download it, open it, and then you start working the same task that I'm demonstrating here with your file. Okay, so now what we're going to do here is to prepare the summary table and prepare some visualizations like bar chart and pie charts, and then do some frequency distribution for numerical variables, histograms, and so on. So the first thing first, one categorical variable, okay, and we want to do a summary of that. So we'll follow the example 2.1 from your textbook, and the 2.1 example is about a sample of 316 retirement funds, okay, and the data is given, and we want to prepare a summary table of the 316 retirement funds by the risk level. Okay, and the funds are categorized into three different possible risk levels: low, average, or high, and we want to prepare a frequency table for that. Okay, let's first look at the data. So in the Excel shell file, I've given three sheets of data that we'll be using throughout this chapter. So the first one is 401k data. So here we have 316 401k retirement fund information. So the data is here. And here is a list of the variables included in the data. Okay. So here, if you look at the variables, you see there is market cap. That's a categorical variable. That is type of fund. That is a categorical variable. And then we have risk. That's also a categorical variable. And the star rating is also categorical. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 stars for each of the funds. So now, I want to now demonstrate preparing a summary table using risk as the categorizing variable. So we go here. Now there are several ways in which we can prepare a summary table. And if you knew what the categories were, we can list the categories and use an Excel function called count A. So the simple function count will only count numerical variables. So it will not count categorical labels as values. For that, you need to use count A. The A stands for alphanumeric. So you can use that count A function. You can do count if. You can do count ifs. So these are several functions we can use to count how many fall into those three categories: low, average, and high. In this case, we knew what those categories were, but sometimes we may not know what the categories are, in which case, how do you go about developing a summary table? Okay. And for that, we'll be using a function or a command in Excel called pivot table. Okay. So if you go to insert, and you see pivot table right there, and it's a very, very powerful capability in Excel that will come in very, very handy in doing many different things. And there is also something called Power Pivot. That's not part of regular Excel, but then it is a free add-on that Microsoft offers that we can download and use for more complex pivot tables. But the regular pivot table gives us very good capabilities. So let's proceed with with the example. So let's so this is how I'm going to do it. There are different ways in which we can do it. What I want to do is to set up the pivot table in an area where it's not going to mess up with any other data that we may have in the file, because sometimes pivot table will erase stuff down below, and if you have some stuff down below, it will get erased, and we don't want that. So we'll prepare the pivot table in a place where there is no other data and we have a blank range of cells. Prepare it, and once we have done that, then we will move it over here. Okay, so let's start by going to the sheet where there is data, and we'll highlight the data. Okay, start from for pivot table to work, the first row has to be a title for the column, so a variable name, if you will, a column name. So what the column stands for. Okay. Then you do press shift, keep the shift key depressed, and then press the end key once, and then the down arrow key. So end, down. So that will highlight the entire column. Now keep the shift depressed. Okay. Now we need to span over to the different columns. So now again press the end key and then the right arrow key. So end, right arrow. So there are other ways of highlighting the entire data in a very quick fashion. So I'll leave it up to you to figure those things out. So now we have the data highlighted. Okay, so now you go to pivot table. Okay, so the data is now described here, and you can place the pivot table in a new worksheet or in an existing worksheet. So we will select existing worksheet. Okay, and we'll select sheet 1 somewhere around here. Okay, remember we're going to move it to where we want it afterwards. Okay, so ignore this, don't check this. Okay, so now what this will do is this will create a kind of a template for the pivot table. Now you can populate the pivot table with the variables that we want. You can have different rows, you can have different columns, and you can summarize the values that you want to count, and you can even filter based on a third variable if you like. Okay, but we want now what we want is a very simple summary table for risk. So click risk, drag it, and drop it as rows. Okay, then immediately it creates the different values. So you didn't have to know what those different categories of risks in the data was. So those categories are automatically generated by pivot table. Okay, now you want to count how many funds are in each of those categories. And you can do that in several different ways. So you can drag the fund number down here, then it'll automatically set the field value to count. Okay, see here, if you click the down arrow and then if you go to value field settings, and this is a very important option, okay, and you will find that there are many different ways in which we can summarize. So you can sum all the values, you can count, you can average, max, min, and so on. The default is if the variable that you're dragging and putting it here, if that variable is a categorical variable, the default is always count, so which will work. Okay, in our case, because what we want is to simply count how many average, how many high, and how many low risk levels. Okay. But on the other hand, suppose instead of using the fund number, suppose if you dragged assets. Okay. Now asset being a numerical variable, the default field setting is sum. So now instead of counting, it's going to take the asset value of each risk level, all the averages, and sum them. So that's not going to give us the frequency, but it's going to give us the sum of all the assets with average risk and high risk and low risk. Okay. So if that happens, sometimes in the data set all the columns are numerical columns. So when you really want to count, then you have to go into the field setting and change the summarization to count. So if you change it to count, then count will be displayed. So when you prepare a pivot table, it is up to you to make sure that you set the field setting correctly. If you want to sum, you have to select sum. If you want to count, you have to select count, and so on. So this is what we want. So this is good. So we are almost done, except there is one other thing that we want to do, that is here the risk levels are not in the proper order. So you have average, you have high, and then low, because the default organizing is alphabetical. Okay. But we don't want alphabetical, we want either descending level of risk or ascending level of risk. Okay. If you want to do it in ascending level of risk, low should go first and then average and then high. So for that you can go and select low here like that and then right click. When you right click, then you have move, and you can move one step up. Okay, if you choose this, then low will go to high and high will come to low. So low go up only by one. But we want to go take low all the way up to the top. So you say move low to beginning. So it takes it all the way there. Okay. So now we have the pivot table organized properly, and we can now go and change the title. So instead of row label, we can say risk. Okay. Instead of saying count of assets, we can say frequency. Okay. And we will right align that title. Okay. So now it looks good. So you have to do all of this when you prepare a table. You just shouldn't simply run a pivot table and just leave it as is. You have to do the sorting of the values. You have to change the labels, and you have to right align or left align and do some formatting that makes the table look good. So now highlight. Okay, now we're going to move this here to this area. This is where we want the pivot table to appear, and the reason why we didn't do it right there is in case the risks were like there are 10 or 15 categories of risk, then this label and that label would get erased by pivot table, and we don't want pivot table to mess up any content that we already have in the Excel file. So we prepare it in an empty space, a blank area, and then move it down here. Put it right there. Okay.